are here.
Finally, I'm here, and I'm just going to take the last 10 minutes before the coffee break to tell you something about the systematic review of care bundles in surgery for the prevention of surgical site infections. And as you all know, surgical site infections are an adverse outcome of surgery, and they account for the majority of all the hospital-acquired infections worldwide, and that's shared first place together with the pneumonia. As you all know, they increase morbidity, mortality, they extend the hospital stay, and they possess an immense burden on the healthcare cost. And since the introduction of systemic antibiotic prophylaxis 5 to 6 decades ago, we really managed to decrease the incidence of surgical site infections. However, we are still trying to chase the zero, and in our way, in our mission to try to get to zero, there were many interventions with various levels of evidence that were invented and tried. And if you would imagine all of these interventions as a stick or as a piece of wood, then perioperative care would probably look like this, a bit of a mess. And if I would ask you and the person sitting next to you to pick a couple of branches to start a fire, then it's very unlikely that you would pick the same branches. So in 2001, the Institute for Healthcare Improvement introduced the care bundle. And a care bundle, the idea of it is that you have a predefined set of interventions that you bundle together, and then it might look a bit like this. And it's used to make sure that all interventions are given to all patients at all times. And a very good example of this, a successful bundle, is the reduction of ventilator-associated pneumonias. So what I'm going to tell you now, the aim of our study was to provide a clear overview of all bundles and all interventions that are bundled in studies, and we wanted to evaluate as well the effect of the SSI prevention bundle on the reduction of surgical site infections. And just to give you a bit of a clinical idea of what we were looking at, we asked ourselves some questions, like how do we want to define a bundle? And it's very usual to say it's 3 to 5 interventions, but we decided to not use a cutoff for that. So a pathway or a protocol was okay, as long as all interventions were given to all patients at all times. We looked at perioperative care, so the interventions had to be preoperative, intraoperative, or postoperative, or some sort of combination of that, and all types of surgeries were included. And we looked at adult patients above 18 years of age. We searched all large databases, and we looked at randomized controlled trials and observational studies, including patients undergoing surgical procedures. And we looked at A versus B grouping, so the use of a bundle versus the standard of care in that hospital, with the primary outcome surgical site infections. We found 26 studies, 2 RCTs with over 1,000 patients, and 24 cohort studies with almost 40,000 patients. The types of surgery were mainly colorectal surgery, but there was also cardiothoracic and all sorts of gynecological procedures. All studies describe systemic antibiotic prophylaxis, otherwise they were excluded as well. So the composition of the bundles was quite different. The smallest bundle was only 3 interventions, and the largest one had 23 interventions. In total, when we looked at all interventions that were performed, we came to 64 different interventions, and the most of them were performed in the intraoperative period. And also the majority of the bundles that were used were in the perioperative period. There were 18 studies actually. If you look at the interventions, you can roughly divide them in 2 sorts of interventions. First, the preventative measures. So you would ask your patient to quit smoking. You looked at ongoing infections, but it's also really the optimal condition of the patient. So make sure that your patient is warm. There's normothermia, normovolemia, normoglycemia. So really patient-focused. On the other hand, you also have the processes of care, which is more the technical aspect, and that could be changing gowns and gloves after every anastomosis or before you start closing, and also the way of the antiseptics that you used, for example. Well, since there is 64 interventions, I'm not going to tell them all to you. And I just made a top 5 of the most used ones. And the first prize goes to hair clipping instead of using a razor if you want to remove hair. The second one is a shed place. It's maintaining normothermia. You should change your gloves and gowns before closing the wound or after every anastomosis. And you should have a pre-operative bathing, whether it's a shower or using of cloths with chlorhexidine gluconate. Third prize is skin preparation with chlorhexidine in alcohol. And as you probably all know, at the end of 2016, the WHO released a new guideline for the prevention of surgical site infections, and they performed around 27 systematic reviews, and they tested all those interventions that are included in the bundles I looked at. And they did some strong recommendations, interventions that they believe are strongly recommended and that you should perform. And there is 2 in the top 5 that actually are in there. What the recommendation for hair clipping is that you actually should not remove hair at all, but if you really have to, you should use a clipper. And secondly, for skin preparation, you should use chlorhexidine in alcohol. Then there is also a moderate quality of evidence recommendations where the WHO says, well, it's a good habit to make sure that your patient is warm during the perioperative period. And it's also a good habit to have a bath or a shower before you go to the OR. But it doesn't really matter if you use plain soap or chlorhexidine gluconate. And then last but not least, well, changing gloves and gowns, we had a look at that. And there were actually 11 studies that said you should do it. But if you look at the evidence, we didn't find any. So we couldn't the WHO couldn't really do a recommendation on that. Back to the studies we found. 2 RCTs, Anthony and all, had a perioperative bundle, which they tested, but they had to terminate the study early, and they didn't see an effect in their study. And then Baldi et al. Also did a randomized controlled trial. But what is important in this trial is that the standard of care already consisted of 5 of the top interventions. So their standard of care was quite high, and they on top of that, did extensive antiseptic measures for the closure of the wound, and I didn't see an effect in that either. Then we also performed a meta-analysis of 24 cohort studies, and we did see a very significant effect for the use of a bundle for the prevention of surgical site infection with an odds ratio of 0.43 and for 95 coincidence interval of 0.33 to 0.57. And there was considerable heterogeneity of 78%. In conclusion, well, there are many interventions that we use into bundles, as I have just showed you, but there are no RCTs supporting the effect of a bundle. In observational studies, though, we do see a significant reduction of surgical site infections with the use of a bundle. And we do have a high heterogeneity, which is explained by the multiple interventions and the timing of the diverse interventions. And this gives us an uncertainty of the effect size and of what the optimal bundle is. Thank you very much.